Hello, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today for this AGSIW webinar looking at the new Iraqi government and the future of the Popular Mobilization Forces. My name is Raymond Karam, and I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. We have a global audience joining us today with over 320 registered attendees tuning in from all around the world. Today's session is part of a new Iraq series that we launched earlier this year under the leadership of AGSIW President and former Ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait, Douglas Silliman, who will be moderating this discussion this morning. He is joined by a distinguished group of speakers, and he will introduce them in more detail shortly. A quick disclaimer before we start: the webinar today is being recorded and will be made available on our website tomorrow. Also, a reminder to our audience, you are in listen-only mode, but you will be able to ask your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can also email us at info@agsiw.org or tag us on Twitter at Gulf States Inst. With that, Ambassador Silliman, over to you.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to have you with us virtually today for AGSIW's discussion as part of our Iraq series on the Popular Mobilization Forces. I think we can all admit that Iraq has had a tough year. Mass demonstrations protesting corruption and the lack of government services pulled down the government of Prime Minister Al Mahdi at the end of 2019. The coronavirus pandemic has stressed an already weak health system. ISIS-Daesh has attempted to reorganize and has launched its most complex attacks in several years. Oil prices have plummeted, and OPEC has cut Iraq's oil production quota by 1 million barrels a day, sparking a budget crisis. Competition between the United States and Iran flared up at the turn of the year with attacks on U.S. forces and an attempt to sack the U.S. Embassy and the killing of Quds Force General Qassim Soleimani and PMF Deputy Commander Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. This U.S.-Iraq tension has opened a serious debate about the future of U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq, as well as raise questions about the Iraqi paramilitary forces, the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF. And this week will be the start of a strategic dialogue between the United States and Iraq that many hope will resolve at least some of these issues. And in the midst of all of this, Prime Minister Mustafa Kadhimi has just become Prime Minister and over the weekend completed his cabinet. He and his ministers have already signaled that they want to take different approaches to address many of these issues, but these issues will remain difficult to address as always. So today we're going to tackle one of these issues, the question of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, and we have assembled an excellent panel to look at this issue from different perspectives. First, we have Ambassador Rend al-Rahim, the co-founder and president of the Iraq Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting democracy, human rights, and civil society in Iraq. She served as Iraq's ambassador to the United States from 2003 to 2005. Dr. Michael Knights is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, specializing in the security affairs of Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and the Gulf states. He earned his PhD from King's College London and is recognized as one of the foremost experts in this field. Ali Alfoneh is a senior fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, where he specializes in Iran. He was born in Tehran, but later moved to Denmark, where he got his university education. And he is the author of the forthcoming book, Political Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Demise of the Clergy, and the Rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which will be published with AGSIW in the next few weeks. Watch this space for more information on the book. So first, I'd like to turn to Mike Knights to describe for us the PMF and the challenges that the PMF poses for new Prime Minister Mustafa Kadhimi. Mike, turn the microphone to you.
Thanks very much. Are you hearing me okay?
We are.
Super. So the fate of this new government in Iraq under Mustafa Kadhimi and efforts to reform the Popular Mobilization Forces are intricately linked. It's arguable that there would not be a Kadhimi government at all without the crackdown on Iraqi protesters in October last year, which was organized, implemented by some of the leaders of the Popular Mobilization Forces, such as Fallah Fayyad, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, Abu Muntader al-Husseini, Abu Zainab al-Lami, and forces like Kataib Hezbollah, Kataib Sayyid al-Shahada, and Soraya Khorasani. So the government is only here in some ways because of some of the mistakes made by some PMF commanders and units last year. For those who are not so au fait with the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, I'll give a little introduction and a sense of what the issues are with this force. It's a new security force since 2014. It drew on some of the former armed opposition elements that were fighting the US occupation prior to 2011, that went to Syria to fight on the side of the Assad regime after 2011. It's then was formalized in 2014 by a combination of political executive orders and a fatwa issued by Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani in Iraq. And it's got 160,000 or so troops. It has a budget of over $2 billion a year. It is a new player on the Iraqi scene compared to the older players like the Iraqi army, the Ministry of Interior, the Counterterrorism Service even. It has a legitimate battlefield role, and we've heard earlier that Islamic State is starting to slowly recover strength in Iraq, but it's not as effective as it could be on the battlefield due to a lack of professionalization and reforms, and it's also out of control off the battlefield. It doesn't answer to national command and control. When the Prime Minister of Iraq, the prior Prime Minister, told it to leave certain areas in Iraq, it simply ignored him and reinforced those areas, the Nineveh Plains being a good example. It takes over command and control of individual Iraqi provinces and displaces the authority of local provincial governments or local military headquarters. Diyala province would be a good example of that, where the PMF has virtually established a principality within Iraq where the Iraqi government does not rule anymore. It's also taken control of a number of Iraq's borders and is able to permit and support through traffic between Iran and Syria, and thus Lebanon, without the say-so of the Iraqi government. It's also undertaken cross-border attacks on neighboring states, at least 2 attacks on Saudi Arabian energy facilities over the last year, even though that is not Iraqi foreign policy. It's the militia's own foreign policy operating under the protection, the rubric of the payment of the Popular Mobilization Forces. It has its own economic empire that it's building up. It's been used as an internal repression force in the anti-government protests since last October. It runs its own private prisons. It has no arrest powers, it has no detention powers, and yet it removes protesters from the streets and it puts them in private prisons. And it's also attacked US forces and British forces in Iraq, killing both Americans and Britain over the last 6 months. It seeks to, some of the PMF leaders seek to remove US and coalition forces from Iraq, even though the job of defeating ISIS is not complete. So it's a state within a state, with its own foreign policy, with its own relations with foreign states. As this government moves forward now, it has a lot of different issues to cover, and it only has about 2 years to cover it in. Mustafa Kadhimi's government is only half a government term, and they have the most severe economic crisis Iraq's ever seen. They have COVID to deal with. They have US-Iran tensions to deal with. But the PMF is still an issue that they will have to touch on in some ways during the next 2 years. And I'll just quickly list 4 things that might be on their agenda. First, justice for the protesters who were killed, wounded, or imprisoned. The release of the missing people. An investigation is going to be underway this year, which will look at both some of the federal security forces, Ministry of Interior, other places, but also the Popular Mobilization Forces to work out where they are keeping some of the illegally arrested and detained protesters, and who was responsible for ordering and executing the killings of protesters from October last year onwards. A second key issue is US-Iraq relations. Many key elements of the PMF are demanding the removal of all foreign forces from Iraq, except, of course, Iranian or Lebanese Hezbollah advisors. They continue to attack US bases, and they continue to claim other attacks on US and coalition forces, which turn out to be not true. Attacks on helicopters, attacks on roadside patrols, on road lines of communication, attacks on fixed-wing aircraft. So a mixture of propaganda claims and real attacks on US military personnel, diplomatic personnel. They want revenge for Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. How does the new government square this circle? A force that wants to revenge itself on the US and drive them out of the country, but they're part of the formal security forces of the country, and it's not Iraqi policy at this stage to remove all foreign forces from the country. Third, budget. Right now, the Iraqi government is going to have to institute massive budget cuts to achieve rough current account balance every month. And that will necessarily include some of the security forces. The first thing they need to do is to understand how many security forces there are. And that means auditing those security forces, including the PMF, to understand how many real troops there are really turning up for work every day who should really be claiming a payroll and benefits. That means a transparency initiative. That means having government oversight into the biometric registration system of the PMF, key card, and how it really functions, not allowing the PMF to discipline and regulate itself with no external oversight. And finally, there are reforms. This week, yesterday actually, Washington Institute put out a short paper on the newest PMF reform memo that came out on June the 3rd. It goes point by point through that. And it builds on some of the work that we've done in our most recent book, which is called Honored Not Contained, and it's a really sort of substantive piece on exactly how the PMF is structured, organized, and how PMF reform might be undertaken to benefit Iraq's national security and other interests. So, there's a lot going on, and I guess one of the key questions for the Academy government is, do they have enough bandwidth to guide PMF reform to ensure that it is in the benefit of Iraq and that it is not merely disguised power consolidation within the PMF and an attempt to quietly increase the numbers of paid members within the PMF and guide its future command and control? Is it real reform or is it fake reform? I'll leave it there. Thanks, Doug.
Mike, thanks very much for that introduction. I'd like to turn next to Ambassador Rend al-Rahim to give us a more Iraqi viewpoint of the security situation and the Popular Mobilization Forces and how Iraqis feel about the issues that I raised this morning, but especially some of the ones that Mike just raised. So, Madam Ambassador, I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Silliman, and thanks for holding this session. I hope you can hear me well. Can you hear me? Good, good. Okay.
Yes, we can.
So I'm going to take a slightly different angle, although I will come back and try to sort of connect with what Michael has said. I wanted to look at the questions about security, and I think that there are three questions that are interrelated. One of them is there a role for US and coalition forces in a security regime for Iraq? Second question is there a role for the Popular Mobilization Forces that Michael described so well? Is there a role for the PMFs, shorthand for Popular Mobilization Forces, in establishing security? And the third question really is, how do you strengthen the indigenous security agencies for Iraq so that we no longer need any outside help? And these three questions connect ultimately with another set of issues which relate to the question of sovereignty, primarily, the question of Iraq's self-interest, and this notion that has been floated inside Iraq among some political parties and the intelligentsia of Iraq first. So these three, the sovereignty, Iraq's interest, and Iraq first. And what is very obvious is that there is absolutely no consensus among the different sectors of the Iraqi population as to the three questions and also how to define the other sort of desirable outcomes of sovereignty, the Iraq first, the interest. And the divisions are pretty stark, actually, within the sort of Iraqi political forces, the Iraqi population. There are quite strong demarcations. Michael referred to the desire of the PMFs to expel U.S. and coalition forces. This was, on January 5th, there was a vote in Parliament to recommend to the Iraqi government to end the presence of foreign troops and essentially U.S. troops. This vote was really driven by two political groups in Parliament, both of which are heavily composed of PMFs. One of them, Fatah, the PMFs and Fatah are, have an alliance with Iran and aligned with Iran. The other one, Sa'irun, which belongs to Muqtada al-Sadr, is sort of, of unknown allegiance. It's very difficult to define where they stand on these issues. But those were the two parties that drove the vote to evict U.S. troops. That vote, by the way, or that session in Parliament was boycotted by the Sunnis and the Kurds. And in fact, the Speaker of Parliament, Halbousi, made an impassioned statement at the time of the vote, saying this was the wrong vote and that it did not represent a national consensus and it did not represent the national interest, and that there should be a much more cohesive view of the role of U.S. and coalition forces. So already in Parliament, we see that kind of division during the vote. In addition to that, I think it's important to point out that there are certain Shia or Shia-led political parties that are not in favor of an exit of coalition forces. I would cite the Nasr, which is headed by Haider al-Abadi, former prime minister, and also Al-Hikmah, which is headed by Ammar al-Hakim, which is, for those, I'm sure everybody knows him, but this started off as as something called ISKI, the Islamic State in Iraq, and so on. And in any case, Hikmah is a predominantly Shia party. Those two are not in favor. So again, another split. But we should mention a further split. The PMFs themselves are not a homogeneous and uniform body. The PMFs are divided into those that are allied to Iran, which are called the Wala'i. In other words, they owe allegiance to Iran. Wala'i PMFs. And those are Badr, Asa'ib al-Haq, Kata'ib Hezbollah, Nujaba, and the list goes on. There are lots of them. And then there are also PMFs that owe allegiance to Sistani and to the Marja'iyya and Najaf. They're called the Atabat PMFs. The Atabat PMFs do not necessarily agree with the Iran allied PMFs in demanding a quick exit of the U.S. and coalition forces. So again, another breakdown. If we come to the population at large, I think it's safe to say that in terms of political parties and in terms of citizens, the Sunnis and the Kurds are very much in favor of a continuing U.S. coalition presence in Iraq to help with security and for other reasons. Those groups are threatened by the PMFs. I think Michael mentioned this very, very clearly. The Popular Mobilization Forces, and particularly those that are allied with Iran, have taken economic, political, and security control in places where they don't really belong. In Diyala province, in Samarra, in Nainawa, they are replacing the local population in all these areas, and that is not only affects the interests of the population, but it actually represents a security threat because it causes polarization. It provides a hospitable environment for ISIS to return in the name of protecting that population. So the Sunnis and the Kurds really would like a continuing presence for the US and the coalition as a counterweight to PMFs and as a counterweight to Iran. And so you have a cleavage based on ethnicity and religion. We look at, we should also say that starting in October, the protesters became a big factor in defining the political landscape of Iraq. And this is a factor we should not ignore, because in any case they are coming back, the protests are returning in a somewhat different form now, but this has become a power that politicians can't ignore. And in fact, they were responsible for the resignation of Ayatollah Mahdi and for a political impasse over 4 months. So the protesters have been very hostile to the influence that the Popular Mobilization Forces exert in Baghdad and the south. And when we think that almost all the protesters are Shia from Baghdad and the south, that makes an enormous difference in the credibility and the legitimacy of the PMFs. But the protesters have also addressed themselves to the US in 2 different ways. One of them is, why isn't the US paying more attention to the fact that we are being killed? Why aren't they denouncing our killers? Why aren't they denouncing those who abduct us and so on? Why isn't the US taking a more active role in support of the protests? But the protesters also have called for Iraqi sovereignty, for an Iraq first agenda, for Iraqi interests, separate from the interests of Iran, separate from the interests of the US. In other words, we want a consensus in which Iraq knows what it wants and can act upon it, separate from Iran and the US, and they certainly reject having Iran used as a battleground. So this issue of sovereignty has also been raised by the protesters. And I think this is something that is coming to play in Mustafa al-Kadhimi's new government. So where does that leave us? We have a situation where Mustafa al-Kadhimi is required to deliver. He's required to deliver to the protesters. He's required to deliver on the economic in the economic arena and so on. And of course, we also have the strategic dialogue. This is going to be an enormous challenge for Mustafa al-Kadhimi. But I would argue that he is in a very good position now. He has momentum. He has support from the population, conditional support and temporary support. But nevertheless, people are giving him some slack. He has support of the political forces, and he has support of the international community. So he really does have a lot going for him. Going back to the PMFs, I think a combination of events since last October have really combined to weaken the Popular Mobilization Forces and to make them vulnerable to the kind of reform that Michael was speaking about. First, because of the hostility of the population in the south. Second, because of the killing of not only Qassim Soleimani, but very importantly, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Sistani has withdrawn his blessing from the PMFs that are not under the command and control of the Iraqi state. And so now they have that legitimacy removed from them and they are exposed. So there are a number of factors that have made them much weaker and much more prone to reform, to bringing under control. Just one more point about the strategic dialogue, which I believe is starting today. I think the issue of sovereignty is going to have to come interplay in the strategic dialogue. And Mustafa al-Kadhimi and the Iraqi team has to be seen stressing and upholding Iraq's sovereignty. But of course, it has to be sovereignty not only vis-a-vis foreign states, other states. It has to be internal sovereignty over its own armed forces, over militias, and so on. In other words, the Iraqi state has to exercise internal sovereignty as well. But I think in terms of these dialogues, I would say that the medium really is the message. The very fact that dialogue is taking place sends a message to Popular Mobilization Forces, other groups in Iraq, that there are two independent sovereign states entering into a discussion about mutual interests and mutual areas of cooperation. I'll stop there.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your comments. I want to turn now to Ali Alfoneh for a little bit of an Iranian perspective on these issues. Ali.
Good morning to you all, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. I would like to answer a very simple question. What is the goal of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Iraq? What strategic objectives is Iran pursuing? And the answer is just as simple as the question itself. Iran desires to maintain Iraq in a permanent state of crisis. Iran does not desire to see Iraq descend into total anarchy, but Iran would like to see Iraq in a state of permanent crisis. Why? Because a state of permanent crisis provides Iran with opportunity to achieve its tactical goals on the ground in that country. If Iraq, on the other hand, is stable, Iran would not be able to intervene in the internal affairs of the Iraqi state. There are three goals that Iran is pursuing. The first one is to secure the overland bridge to Syria and Lebanon. If there is a truly sovereign government in Baghdad, independent of Iran, it may have its own policy objectives. And there is no guarantee that such a government would allow the Islamic Republic to have free access to overland to Syria and Lebanon. Right now, Iran has that opportunity. Second, Iran would like to use Iraq also in the future in its struggle for power with the United States. As we have seen before, the Islamic Republic has used Iraqi ground and territory to settle scores with the US. And whenever tensions between Iran and the US are very high, we also tend to see a more aggressive Iranian policy on the ground in Iraq. In that matter, we can see that Iraq is kept hostage by the Islamic Republic in relations with the United States. We are likely to see more of that, but right now, for example, we are seeing de-escalation in relations between Iran and the US, and therefore we also see a more constructive Iranian approach in Iraq. Third has really nothing to do with the US, but it has to do with the core interests of the Iranian state in Iraq. Not only the Islamic Republic, but even the Shah's regime, they were extremely concerned about presence of the seats of religious authority in Najaf. The Islamic Republic, for natural reasons, is even more interested in being able of exerting some degree of control over the holy city of Najaf, because of the fact that Iran does not like to see several Shia popes, if you want. In the early history of Christianity, we have had at times up to 3 popes within the Catholic Church. Iran wants to avoid that. Iran wants to see the head of state in Iran also being the preeminent Shia religious leader in the world. And one of the ways of securing this is by having and exerting great influence over the holy city of Najaf. For all these reasons, the Islamic Republic is utilizing the instrument of the Popular Mobilization Forces. But it is not following a standardized model. The model that the Islamic Republic is using in Iraq is not the same model that it used, let's say, in Lebanon. In Lebanon, for some time, Iran supported two Shia militias, Amal and Hezbollah. But after some time, it was in the interest of the Islamic Republic to concentrate all the Shia militias in one organization, which today is known as Hezbollah. In Iraq, Iran is pursuing a slightly different approach, and that is to have, yes, the Popular Mobilization Force as an umbrella organization, but under the umbrella, Iran is actually contributing and is supporting to a very diffuse command structure by maintaining smaller militias under the umbrella as separate even from the PMF leadership. So there are not clear lines of command. And that, by the way, tells me that Iran is concerned that even Iraqi militias, who have until now been beneficiaries of Iran's largesse and have gained power and influence in Iraq because of the Islamic Republic, may end up pursuing a nationalist Iraqi agenda. Therefore, it is in the interest of the Islamic Republic to have a greater degree of rivalry and competition within those and among those militias, so we do not even see a unified Shia militia structure, let alone a Shia militia which is subservient to the civilian authorities in Baghdad. Therefore, any attempt by the central government in Baghdad either to incorporate the PMF into the greater body of the armed forces of Iraq, or to preserve the PMF as a separate unit, but under political civilian control, those efforts will be undermined by the Islamic Republic for the very simple fact that Tehran desires to see Iraq in a state of permanent crisis. Not collapse, not total anarchy, but a permanent state of crisis. Thank you.
Ali, thank you very much. I'd like to consolidate a couple of things that all of you have said. I mean, Ali talking about the Iran's desire not to have a unified PMF under Iraqi civilian control. Ambassador Rahim's comment that the killing of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis has caused some rifts within the PMF and has caused a bit of a crisis within the PMF. And Mike, I want to ask you, I mean, the desire of Atabad PMF to leave the PMF structure itself may contribute to this as well. What has happened to the PMF in the past 4 or 5 months? And is this a short-term trend, or is this something that could end up pulling the PMF leadership and its authority into different directions?
You want me to kick off?
Yeah, why don't you kick off, Mike, and then maybe Ambassador Rahim will have some comments.
Okay. Normally I'd say ladies first, but I'll warm up. So I'll be your warm-up act, Rend. Okay, so I think we have seen a number of elements within the PMF structure act with more confidence since Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was killed. They, and Soleimani as well, the two were a double act. You know, Soleimani gave Muhandis so much authority, and he was a very effective political operator. He used that power effectively. So when with both of them gone, it had a significant impact. Those tensions had already been there in previous years, where the Atabur, the shrine units of the PMF, answering primarily to Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, had already been chafing under the kind of favoritism within the PMF that favored those pro-Iran Walay PMF, the kind of Iranian-backed elements, the resistance, facile groups. You know, they had been running the show, particularly Kataib Hezbollah, for many years, and a number of people, you know, shall we say, an uprising had been brewing for a while. And with Muhandis and Soleimani gone, that they become much more assertive, and they had more confidence. So, you know, what we've seen this year is them say, and the Muqtada al-Sadr said a very similar thing, either the PMF has to change fundamentally, or we will leave it. Either, and you know, Muqtada has characterized the choice as either the PMF has to change, or it could be disestablished. The Atabur put it slightly differently: either it has to change, or they will leave. the primarily Sunni tribal mobilization forces may also be making similar calculations. But you know, what's important to stress is that for very few of these actors is complete disestablishment, near-term disestablishment of the PMF, their plan A. It's more likely their plan B if the Iran-backed elements do not loosen their grip on the leadership positions within the PMF structure. Because disestablishing the PMF in the near term is a big step. It's a very politically assertive step that would undoubtedly create tremendous backlash from within the armed movements. And so most people instead would rather perhaps change some of the key leadership positions, like the chairman of the PMF, the deputy chairman, vice chairman, operations chief of the PMF, or the chief of staff of the PMF. That's where I think they're going to be looking at. Now, since Muhandis and Soleimani died, we certainly have seen a segmentation of the PMF. We've seen some elements lay very low, you know, physically very cautious about being targeted by the Americans. Asab al-Haq would be one of them. We've seen, and Khattab al-Imam Ali under Shibal al-Zaidi would be another one. Others went straight to Tehran the moment Muhandis and Soleimani were killed, and they signed up. You know, we're up for it. Let's move forward. Even some satirist elements of the PMF tried to sort of assert a leadership role and went to Tehran to go and sort of broker that. So, you know, yeah, we see a lot of moving parts within the PMF right now. And there's a spectrum of views on whether US-backed led coalition forces should stay or leave, even within the PMF. And, you know, what we're waiting to see is whether the PMF leadership will be diversified and some non-cosmetic reforms put in place in the coming 3 to 6 to 9 months, or whether more elements of the PMF will essentially leave their operational structure, even if they are still paid through that structure, and assign themselves directly to the Prime Minister's office. Over.
Rend, if I can ask you to comment on that, but maybe to add a couple of questions from the audience as well. The first of which is there any scenario under which Ayatollah Ali Sistani would essentially revoke the 2014 fatwa, which created the volunteers, and then more down in the weeds, what is the future of Hadi al-Amiri? Why has he given up his parliament seat? How does the politics of the PMF play into the questions we're talking about?
Okay, thank you. If I may, Michael gave a very good, much better overview than I could, but I want to add one point, and I don't know if Michael agrees with me. I think that with the departure of Muhandis, the sort of cohesion and the command and control of the PMS kind of unraveled. And of course, there was a suggestion to replace him with somebody called Abu Fadak. And Abu Fadak is also from Kataib Hezbollah. So Kataib Hezbollah wanted to retain control of the PMS. This is not acceptable to a broad range of other PMFs. So there is, I think, a certain rivalry, competition for supremacy, for leadership of the PMS that did not exist under Muhandis. So I think we're seeing fissures, and I don't know if Michael agrees with that analysis. But to go on to, can Sistani rescind his fatwa? No. Once a fatwa is made, you can't rescind it. He can't rescind it. But the fatwa, of course, did not say go and form militias. The fatwa said join the armed forces in order to protect Iraq. It was a very deliberate misinterpretation of the fatwa by PMFs who existed before the fatwa was given. So in a sense, the fatwa itself doesn't allow the kind of rampant paramilitary forces to form and to be outside the control of the state. So the answer to that is no, it can't be rescinded. Once you issue a fatwa, you can't unissue it. On the future of Amiri, Yes, his resignation. It sounded like, you know, people when resign in the U.S. they say, to save face, they say they want to spend more time with their family. And Amri said he wants to spend more time rebuilding Badr and the Badr political organization. It's very unclear. There was some speculation that he may be appointed as head of the Hashd to replace Saleh al-Fayyad. Saleh al-Fayyad has been the head of the Hashd for since the commission of the Hashd was formed, and he's not very popular. So it could be that Amri is looking forward to that. He may be aspiring to other things. It's very difficult to tell. I don't know if anybody else has views on this. But it was very striking, and it's obvious that he is looking for a brighter future for himself.
Thank you very much. Let me draw in a couple of other questions on the internal political aspect, internal security aspect of Iraq. I think both for Rend and for Mike. One question is, given the increase in PMF activity in Diyala, Nineveh, and other disputed areas, what are the possibilities of PMF clashes with the Peshmerga, and how could they be avoided? And a broader question, essentially, isn't the problem of the Popular Mobilization Forces really just a manifestation of the ethno-sectarian fragmentation in Iraq post-2003, and can you really deal with it without dealing with the underlying ethno-sectarian question? So those are not, they're sort of related, especially with regard to the Kurds. I don't know which of you might want to take that one on first.
There have been clashes between the PMFs and the Peshmerga. There were clashes in Nineveh province and on the borders between Mosul and Nineveh and Erbil province. There were clashes in Kirkuk. There have been clashes in Diyala. So clashes between Peshmerga and PMFs have occurred over the last several years. And this is one of the reasons, of course, that the presence of the PMFs where they should not be is a security risk. It creates tensions, it creates a possibility of fighting. It also opens doors for ISIS to come in. So that has happened. Recently, the Iraqi army has actually intervened in Kirkuk to separate the two forces. I'm sorry, the second question eluded me.
Well, the second question is essentially, isn't the differences between the Hashd and other security forces a symptom of ethno-sectarian divisions that emerged after 2003, especially now that there is significant representation in the parliament, and how do you address that? I know that's a very difficult second part of the question.
Yeah, I don't think that it's because the Hashd and the security forces is a question of ethno-sectarian, because after all, a large proportion of the regular army, the regular armed forces, are in fact Shia, and many of the leaders are Shia. The Ministry of Defense is a Sunni traditionally, Ministry of Interior is a Shia traditionally, but in terms of the officers and so on, the majority are Shia. This is not what it is. What it is that the PMFs do not want to be under the command and control of the state structure. That's all it is. It's as simple as that. Maybe Michael has more to add.
Well, Mike, let me add a question on from Ambassador Faisal al-Strabadi, who's certainly an expert in the topic as well. He wants to know whether the narrative in Iraq of disbanding the PMF being detrimental to the fight against ISIS-Daesh is real, and are the Iraqi security forces themselves too weak to handle ISIS? So in other words, can the PMF define their role by saying the security forces simply cannot handle the job, and they are needed to go forward?
Sure, I'll tackle that and tag on a little bit to the last question as well. On joint security mechanisms, e.g., the kind of operations along the federal Kurdish front line, There are very few places where the militias and the Peshmerga overlap. You know, it's a hard front line now. It's not like it was back in 2010 when we had literally overlapping forces that were layered on top of each other, and we could do things like trilateral, you know, checkpoints where you had Peshmerga and army and US forces on the same checkpoint. Now it's more complicated than that. What you do have though is PMF overlapping with Kurdish populations in areas that the Peshmerga have withdrawn from or been evicted from in 2017. Those would include places like Kirkuk City, most importantly, and the area between Kirkuk City and Diyala province. So Dakuk, Duzhamatu, and then go northeast towards the Iranian border, Al-Rahim district. Those are the places where PMF are perhaps being most bothersome to Kurdish populations. Not necessarily Kurdish majority populations in all of those places. There's, on that southern part of the Kurdistan federal Iraq front line, there's clearly a lot of work to be done on tightening up joint security mechanisms, on ensuring that every area has a roughly representative armed force working in it, who can work with the population and are not viewed as outsiders. In some places, you know, that might, at this point in history, that will probably include increasing the Kurdish influence and liaison with those local security forces. Had we been talking 5 years ago, we would be talking about instead increasing, in many places, the Shia Turkoman involvement in the local security forces. The pendulum has swung back and forth a number of times. What we want it to do is settle in the middle. So that's something that the international community can help with. I know UNAMI is looking very closely at joint security mechanisms for those areas. In terms of, you know, this idea of Iraq's ethno-sectarian, you know, backdrop being the problem. Look, a grand bargain at national level, true reconciliation and political stability in Iraq, of course, would be awesome as a backdrop for security sector reform. It would make it much easier. But we can't magic that up, and certainly not at the speed required. I think bottom-up initiatives are what we should be aiming at, and they can be successful at local level, even though they would be easier if they had a better national backdrop. So I don't believe a grand bargain is necessary to improve localized command and control and community relations involving the PMF, Peshmerga, and other forces. Earlier, it's mentioned this idea of roles and missions. That's the key thing that's missing in Iraq with regard to the PMF and the security forces more generally. We have a number of security forces that have overlapping missions or undefined missions, the PMF being the most egregious example of that. What we need to have is a national level review of Iraqi defense strategy, and internationals as key donors to the Iraqi security sector can no doubt provide some support, technical support, assistance and funding for that. But that would necessarily define the roles and missions of all the different security agencies in Iraq, which would of course include the PMF. That may be a way of working out what PMF should and shouldn't be doing in the future, so that they can always be a net gain to Iraqi security instead of in some places a net detriment. I will just say, in some of the areas where ISIS is strongest, it's no coincidence that those are the areas where the PMF have never allowed the coalition to support Iraqi operations. ISIS knows that if they go to Diyala, if they go to southern Saladin province, where the coalition has never been allowed to operate because of PMF restrictions, they can hide from air power, from advanced intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. Well, that's something that we don't want to happen anymore. If we want to finish off ISIS, if Iraq wants to finish off ISIS, you know, there should be cooperation across the whole country with the 80-member international coalition. Over.
Let me broaden the scope of the discussion a little bit and ask Ali to address a couple of questions. First one is relatively simple. Is the PMF the only way through which Iran tries to exert influence in Iraq? But more generally, is there a role for other countries in the region? The GCC countries, Jordan or even Turkey, in, if you will, strengthening Iraqi sovereignty the way that Rend described it earlier? And what might Iran's response be to that. So, Ali, a couple of questions for you.
The Islamic Republic, and before that, even the Shah's regime in the 60s and 70s, used many different ways of trying to exert influence in Iraq. The Shah famously supported the Kurdish rebellions against the central government in Baghdad. The Islamic Republic inherited the same infrastructure and the same intelligence officers from the 1960s, and 60s and 70s, used them during the Iran-Iraq war, for the same purpose, more or less. But that was only one part of Iran's effort. Another effort, of course, is the religious influence and all the money that the Islamic Republic is using in places of pilgrimage, in Shia shrines, in economic contributions to theological seminaries, to individual religious leaders who will receive funding from Iran if they preach a certain line of theology at the schools. And of course, there is also the economic dimension. All the companies of the Islamic Republic engaged in post-war reconstruction of Iraq, or those companies engaged in reconstruction of the holy shrines, the hotel business, previously even use of Iranian currency, not so much today because of the inflationary tendency of the riyal. So there are multiple ways that the Islamic Republic has attempted to exert influence in Iraq. Other countries can be even more successful than Iran in this regard. Most of the Persian Gulf Arab countries have vast economic resources that they can use to invest in Iraqi economy. But I suspect some of their concerns is that if they invest the money in Iraqi economy, will that benefit Iran or will it give them greater influence on Iraqi territory? So that's one of the things that they will be considering. Turkey has been doing the same thing. Quite remarkable how much Turkish companies have invested even in the Kurdish areas of Iraq in order to get influence. And the Kurdish political parties, both the Barzanis and the Talibanis, have welcomed foreign direct investment in the Kurdistan region. So yes, Iran can be outcompeted in certain fields, but particularly when it comes to the militias, I do believe that the Islamic Republic has still an advantage.
Thank you. Rend, please go ahead.
Can I just come in here? The question of exerting influence, I think, is a sensitive expression. And saying, how can the Gulf countries exert influence? I think most Iraqis will say, we want less influence by everyone. I think one should put it more in terms of could cooperative relations be improved? And that would be a healthier formulation for it. I would say that one of the problems we have had is that other Arab countries, perhaps with the exception of Jordan, have not been very sympathetic and have been rather afraid of engaging with Iraq and with Iraqis, and especially engaging with a broad spectrum of Iraqis. Now, there are reports that they have engaged with, the Sunnis. Some countries are accused of funding extremism. If this is anecdotal, we don't have documentation, but what we need is engagement on the political, social sector across a broad spectrum of the population. And if the Arab world shies away, the vacuum will be filled by Iran necessarily. I mean, this is a classic case. We saw it in Lebanon and we saw it in Iraq. So we do absolutely need this engagement, not influence, but cooperative engagement with Iraq.
Thank you. Mike, I've got sort of a group of questions for you about different ways in which the PMF might be reformed going forward by drawing individuals out of the PMF into the military, breaking up PMF units and distributing them among the military, different funding mechanisms from the government or international donors. How do you think the PMF might actually pragmatically be reformed over time if it is in fact necessary, other than defining the roles and missions that you discussed in your last answer?
Okay, so yeah, command and control is one issue, as in leadership. Roles and missions definition is another one. And we're already seeing a little bit of movement on the roles and missions because, you know, you can see that, for instance, they're talking about removing all PMF offices and units from cities. You know, that's going to take a lot of implementation and it's going to take a lot of monitoring to make that happen. There's all sorts of ways you can avoid and get around that. But, you know, it's at least a step in the right direction. And I think it's one of the most consensus issues about the PMF, which is that people don't want them in the cities. They're supposed to be on the front lines. If they're activated at all, it's to fight Daesh. So why are they securing certain high-income streets in Baghdad? That doesn't make sense. So in terms of individual or unit level reintegration, you know, we've seen the Attabah elements have early negotiations with MOD about how they might reintegrate. In the past, we've had unit level integration. The Badr movement in 2003 basically integrated wholesale into the Iraqi military. They did it as units, they did it as individuals. When you integrate as units, you certainly do have less effect on the original culture of the troops. And you don't sort of mix and blend them together in a national unit. So there are downsides to unit integration. I've spoken to Hadi Al-Amri about, you know, his experience of doing unit level integration of the Badr forces in 2003 to 2005. He certainly got a lot of ideas about how you would do that again. But one of the things that he said was, you know, that the military culture of the Hashid is so different from the military culture of the Iraqi army or the federal police. It's more different than the difference between Badr in 2003 and the Iraqi army. It's, you know, the Hashid military culture is much looser, much less disciplined. And as a result, it will take much longer time to integrate. So, you know, some people talk about an in-between phase whereby basically you remove Hashid units to cantons, to barracks, and then you do a degree of professionalization and cultural change on them at that level before you attempt to integrate them as individuals or as units into the Iraqi military structure. These are some of the ideas that are rolling around out there.
Okay. Our time is nearly up. Let me finish with one final question to Ali and then a last question to Rend. Ali, a good question from the audience. Has the COVID pandemic changed the way that Iran has approached its proxy forces, especially in Iraq? And is there room, because of the pressure of the pandemic or the maximum pressure campaign from the Trump administration, for some sort of an informal deal between Tehran and Washington or Tehran and Baghdad to reduce their support or influence on the PMF?
The pandemic itself has not impacted Iran's operations, but it has impacted perception of Iran abroad. The Iraqis now see Iran as a semi-failed state, which is incapable of dealing with the pandemic, and by the way, has contributed to the further spread of the pandemic to Iraq. So in that sense, I think it has angered the Iraqi population, including people who may not necessarily have to begin with been anti-Iran. When it comes to the US-Iran deal, yes, I do certainly believe that Iran's behavior in Iraq, to some extent, is a function of the state of affairs between the United States and Iran. When the US is exerting extreme pressure against Iran, Iran responds in Iraq. But now we are seeing remarkable tendencies in Iran-US relations. We saw a prisoner exchange. We saw the president Trump's tweet saying that the Islamic Republic should not wait for another administration, but should reach an agreement with the Trump administration. And finally, we saw Iran delivering gasoline to Venezuela, an entire flotilla of ships. And Washington did not react to it at all, even though in the past, Washington has been extremely sensitive about similar things, even asked the British government to seize an Iranian tanker trying to transfer oil to Syria, which is also sanctioned. So now that we see de-escalation between the US and Iran, we also see slightly more constructive Iranian approach in Iraq.
Rend, if I can ask you a final question and you can close out our session for us, comes from our good friend in Indiana, and I'm going to expand on it just a bit. Is it possible for the Prime Minister to actually take actions that are serious against the PMF, and maybe more broadly, for Iraqis, for the protesters in the streets, for Iraqi politicians? Where does this fall on the list of their priorities with dealing with COVID, economic development, international relations in general, and strengthening sovereignty? How does dealing with the PMF fall on the list of priorities for Iraqis and or the Prime Minister in general?
As I watch Mustafa Kadhimi, I can see that he is moving cautiously but steadily. There are certain indicators. One of them is that the appointments he has made in the Ministry of Defense are very telling. And it's not just the Minister of Defense, but he has appointed a number of people in the Ministry of Defense. He has removed people at the DG level. He has appointed a new person to head his office. He is moving to replace people in sensitive positions with people whom he can trust and who the population can trust. So that is what I call moving cautiously. In terms of responding to the requirements of the protesters, certainly as far as I can see, he has a commitment to protecting protesters, to carrying out investigations on who the perpetrators of murders, abductions, and so on. And we already have a committee which is functioning, which is establishing a database of all those who have been killed, all those abducted, all those who have gone missing. That commission is functioning now. And the commission is also working closely with the UN to establish the basics for this kind of data gathering. So there is work being done, and I think there is a commitment for the protesters to respond to their demands. The problem is none of this can happen very quickly. Any kind of data gathering, any evidence gathering, any holding people to account has to be done on standards which are unassailable. And to do that takes a period of time. And this is what, I wrote recently about the challenge of meeting expectations, high expectations. How quickly can you meet expectations? I think Kadhimi is moving cautiously, surely, maybe a bit too slowly, I don't know. But he certainly is moving in the right direction.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I want to thank all of our audience for tuning in. My apologies to everyone for running a few minutes over time, but it was a very interesting discussion. So for Ali Alfoneh, for Dr. Michael Knights, for Ambassador Rend Al-Rahim, thank you for taking the time to be with us today at AGSIW to talk about Iraq and the PMF. And for all of you in the audience, please follow AGSIW at our website, www.agsiw.org, or on Twitter at Gulf States Inst. We will continue talking about this topic and bringing together the best minds in the business in the future. So to all the participants and audience members, thank you very much and have a good day today.